Kia ora, welcome to episode 94 of Talking Dairy. You take pride in looking after your cows. That's what good farming is all about. But once they leave the farm, their care is out of your hands. Since 2012, we've been talking to farmers about animal care, and one thing is clear. You want to do right by your cows, right to the end. In this episode, Dr. Stacey Hendriks and Penny Timmer-Arends share 3 simple things you can do to set your cull cows up for a low-stress journey. Water, roughage and rest. Get this right and you'll know your cows are well prepared for transport and will arrive in good shape. Tēnā korua, thank you for joining us today, Stacey and Penny.
Thanks, Jack.
Kia ora.
Penny, you've been in animal welfare for 14 years, including share milking down south. What brought you to this role at DairyNZ?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I mean, I've always had an interest in animals and looking after them. Not from a farming background originally. I'm a townie, but yeah, sort of met someone who was farming and went out on farm, which is always the trap, isn't it? And loved it. Loved the cows, loved the calves, loved, being in the shed and the rhythm of milking and a herringbone and that sort of thing. And then I guess sort of more the office-based part of my role is, sort of project management and developing tools and resources for farmers that are going to kind of help them put those things into place. I think everyone wants to do the right thing, sort of probably knows what that is, but sometimes you need help with a plan or a template or something just to make that a little bit easier in your farming business. And my sort of background working for government was sort of translating regulations and rules into plain English for all species and all audiences. So it's quite nice just to hone in on cows and calves and talking to our dairy farmers.
Thank you, Penny. Stacey, you're an animal scientist with a background in dairy cow health and welfare. You grew up on a farm in Geraldine. That must have shaped your career. Tell us about that and your research into transition cows. What are transition cows?
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I would say my earliest memory of dairy farming was spraying teats in the cow shed for 50 cents when I was probably about 8 years old when my parents were share milking in the Waikato, and then eventually my parents slowly worked their way into farm ownership and ended up in Geraldine. So I spent a lot of my teenage years, out on the farm, helping out with the day-to-day running of the farm, and really, really loved farming and loved being outdoors. But I kind of wanted to make a career out of it, but I wasn't sure if I wanted to specifically go farming, and I always loved doing the animal health stuff on farm. I loved, treating a lame cow and just seeing that positive impact you could have by either putting in preventative measures or, helping with solutions to try and cure them of any of their ailments. So it was kind of, I guess, a natural progression for me to go into a Bachelor of Animal Science at Massey University. And I really kind of just followed my passions, to be honest, as cliche as that sounds. I didn't really leave Geraldine thinking I was going to become a scientist. In fact, I don't know if I even knew what a scientist was other than, Dexter's Lab kind of type of scientist. It's probably like showing what generation I'm from now. But yeah, so I ended up really just following my passions. I really enjoyed animal science and I got an opportunity to do a PhD. And at the time, it was when the use of wearables was really not taking off in a commercial space, but was being increasingly utilised in a research sense. So we were already starting to use wearables to generate large data sets.
What's a wearable?
A wearable is a device that's fitted to a cow, so it might be a collar or a leg band, and it's able to measure behaviours in cows. So that might be rumination behaviour or lying behaviour, for example, or activity. Essentially, farmers are now using them to manage different aspects of their farm system, but back then we were sort of just really dabbling in the space, and we were interested to see whether or not we could pick up changes in behaviour that might indicate that a transition cow, which is a cow that is 3 weeks before or 3 weeks after calving, so in that period where they're usually at risk of more metabolic issues, whether they had differences in their behaviour that we could detect with these tools to essentially in the future use them as predictive tools so that we could maybe predict an animal that was going to be at risk of having problems during the transition period. So yeah, that is my background, and it kind of has a really nice crossover with the transportation of cows, because we do know that there are some risks for metabolic issues during transport, and some of the physiology really does translate across.
Thank you, Stacey. So we're talking about transport today, particularly of cull cows. Penny, can you tell us what farmers are already doing to prepare their cows for transport?
Yeah, sure. So a little bit of background before I kind of get into some of the information is we've been running what's called the Animal Care Consults since I think about 2012. And for the last 6 years have asked the same sort of consistent questions around cull cow transport. And so in collecting that data, it's not just transport questions. We had our staff go out on farm, sit down like 1.5 to 2 hours. So it is a significant contribution from the farmer for their time and sharing the information with us. And we asked about a whole host of things, sort of probably those kind of traditional animal health areas like your colostrum management and Springer cow care and things. And then in the last few years have pushed more into the positive welfare space. So asking about your cow's time budget. So, how long does she have to spend being a cow out in the paddock, grazing, doing sort of cow things versus her sort of working hours when she's in the dairy shed waiting to be milked. So kind of pushing into that space as well. So the data we collect is really useful internally to inform some of our extension work and research needs, but also those conversations with the farmers brings through some just really rich information and often some really cool tips and tricks that farmers are doing that we wouldn't know otherwise and can kind of share that. So it's a really cool project. Specifically around the cull cow transport, we've been asking farmers a series of questions, and the ones where it's been over 90% for those last 6 years is farmers are asking where their cull cows are going. So where's the location of the meatworks, just to try and, work out that journey distance. And there's also someone there present to help the transporter load the cows into the truck. Sometimes things might change sort of at the time when the transporter turns up. You might find out it's a slightly different location. So farmers are there helping and can kind of make those calls at the time. And we know from sort of the information we get through from the veterinarians based at the meatworks, so they're working largely for food safety, so assuring that our food's safe to go into the market overseas, but they're also looking for animal welfare things. And we know dairy farmers are doing a really good job selecting cows that aren't injured or ill or have any of those kind of obvious signs. And some cows that maybe are a little bit marginal, but they've got a veterinary certificate, so the farmers sought that expert opinion and has sent them somewhere appropriate for that journey. So we know farmers are doing a really good job in that space.
And if anyone listening wants to hear more about the animal care consults that Penny talked about, you can check back to episode 76, where she goes into far more detail. Stacey, you've been crunching the numbers from those animal care consults on cull cows and transport. What trends have you seen over the last 6 years?
Yeah, so I guess just to give the listeners maybe a little bit more background, we've been collecting this data since 2012, as Penny said, but previously we've sort of been looking at it year on year and then maybe comparing it to the previous year, but we weren't really able to look at the data across time. But DairyNZ has made it a large priority to ensure that data is being placed into a centralised location. So actually, as part of my role when I first got involved with this data was actually trying to get all of the data back to 2012 into one place, and it means that we can actually look at questions that have been asked consistently over time and we can start to track some trends over time. So that's been a really valuable resource for us. And it's allowed us to actually have a look at the 12 different pre-transport practices that we ask about over the last 6 years. So we have been asking consistent questions since 2018. So we have typically asked this question around whether farmers are always or sometimes undertaking a certain practice. And as Penny mentioned, there are quite a few of those practices, particularly those around, asking where cows are going and being present at loading, that are being asked really consistently, and farmers are always doing it, and those numbers are over 90%, which is great. The only areas that we feel we could improve on, it would be nice to see those numbers, above 90%, similar to other pre-transport practices, is around the provision of water and providing roughage before transport. So what we are seeing is that the number of farmers that are always doing this is increasing as opposed to the number of farmers sometimes doing it. So that's great. But yeah, we still really want to have, over 90% of farmers always doing these practices. So always providing water and always providing roughage.
Okay, we'll come back to why those two things are very important. Penny, we'll go to you. Once cows leave the farm, their journey's out of the farmer's hands, essentially. So tell us what happens beyond the farm gate.
So I guess, your cows get loaded on the truck and it's a little bit maybe out of sight, out of mind, not really thinking about that journey. You know where they're going because we know farmers are asking that. But if your cows were the first to be collected and a truck and trailer unit's roughly 40 cows, you've sent 6, you think your neighbours have probably sent a small handful as well. That journey could be longer than you maybe think about because the truck is going to different farms to collect that load. And then once they've done their pickups, they'll head to the processing plant and offload them. And depending on kind of the time of day and that particular plant, they might be there overnight. So they might have got picked up later in the day and they'll start processing in the morning, or they might be doing what's called same-day kill. So sort of depending on that, the cows could be on the truck for a lot longer than maybe you thought when you kind of heard that location. And then they could be in lairage or waiting at the processing plant for a range of time as well. There's water at the processing plant, so they can rehydrate when they get there. But often the yards are sort of a concrete surface or a metal grating, which cows don't like. They're very picky about where they choose to lie down, and concrete and metal is definitely not on their list. And the same for the surface in the trucks as well. It's also really different for a cow. I mean, I think we all know that cows love routine. They like to come into the shed in the same order. Number 29 might not come in unless you give her the scratch on the head. Like, they've all got their little sort of idiosyncrasies and things that they need. And transport's very unfamiliar for them. They're in with cows that might not be in their normal sort of social hierarchy. They're moving, obviously. And yeah, it's just a very strange environment for a cow, which can set them up for some metabolic challenges, which I'll let Stacey talk on a little bit longer. For the hardcore listeners of Talking Dairy, Jack, people might have heard you on way back on episode 6. We did a really cool episode riding along with a stock truck driver. I don't know, you might have picked up some stuff from him as well that you can kind of add to the conversation.
Thanks, Penny. That was a long time ago. Yeah. Yes, I was lucky enough. I actually went on 2 truck rides, one to kind of like test out what we were going to do and then one to actually record. So we recorded the second one for the podcast. A couple of things stood out. You talked about the trip time. Between those 2 trips, it varied a lot, even though it was essentially the same trip. We were picking cows up from the same area and taking them to the same local processor, but one trip took less than 5 hours and the other took more than 10 because there was, some roadworks and a farmer not quite ready, and we couldn't take the trailer to one set of yards, so we had to shuffle back and forth. Oh yes, some cows needed to go somewhere else, so they were left at a central yard for collection, for transport logistics, but that increased the journey for those cows. So that's one thing I noticed. The other was the care that the truckies take. So they're assessing the cattle before loading and they're checking on them frequently. And they really notice if we haven't prepared our cows well. If the cows are not comfortable, they'll bang around. They can hear them banging around in the truck. I noticed at each stop they check if any have gone down, and they're usually more worried about the dairy cows that are still in milk because of those metabolic problems. That's what I remember. But Penny, that's what I noticed in just a couple of trips. But you were at MPI before you came to us, and you worked with transporters and processors. Does that line up with what you saw or heard from them?
Yeah, absolutely. They kind of know the farmers in the area. They've been in the job for a long time, and they kind of know which farmers are going to do a good job. They know who's got the easier yards. Some yards maybe need a little bit of R&M, or they're not quite designed right, particularly if it's sort of the loading ramp on the end of your dairy yard, which is not designed for cattle flow and loading the way that sheep and beef farmers' yards are absolutely set up for that really efficient flow and easy handling. And the transporters I speak to, they're very cognizant of their impact on the cows, so like heavy braking and accelerating and things. They're really conscious that driving smoothly is going to be better for animal welfare as well.
Thanks, Penny. Stacey, what are the biggest risks for cows during transport, and how can we set them up for a smooth trip?
So I guess just to reiterate, I think something that Penny has already said is that during transport, obviously cows are not going to have access to feed or water. So by providing roughage and water before transporting is quite important. And I guess to give a little bit of the physiology or biology behind it, I'm sure that most farmers would agree that it's pretty obvious that cows need, water and feed to function normally and optimally. But in terms of, I guess, why it's important in terms of other functions, so roughage in particular stimulates rumination, and this is really important to maintain a healthy rumen environment. So rumination itself actually helps to balance the pH in the rumen. And so if you have an imbalance in the rumen pH, that can cause issues for cows. So ensuring that they have roughage before they are transported will just ensure that that functioning continues as normal. Typically, it also ensures that you're feeding a slightly less soluble feed than if you're providing really fresh pasture. And this reduces the potential that they sort of end up with a lot of effluent during transportation, which can actually make the journey slightly less comfortable for those animals if there is a lot of effluent on the truck. So that sort of just helps to also provide a little bit more of a comfortable journey for those animals. And then provision of water, really just around keeping those cows well hydrated, super important for helping them regulate their temperature. During transportation, they can be exposed to warm temperatures. They're in a confined space. Airflow can be somewhat reduced. And so just ensuring that they can thermoregulate. And it's also important for helping them to excrete waste products from their bodies. So it just really supports their normal functioning. And then something else that is really important to consider is that during transport, those animals are on a moving vehicle and they're going to be using their muscles to maintain their balance. And this can be quite physically demanding on top of it being stressful. And so ensuring that those cows have an area to rest before transportation is really important as well. And that will really set them up for a better journey. Jack also talked about, lactating cows being those high-risk animals that transporters are really concerned about, and that's grounded in evidence. There is evidence that lactating cows are especially at risk. They are still producing milk, and when they are off feed, they're not able to replenish calcium through feed and energy. And then also water as well is important to support lactation, and they are also obviously unable to replenish water intake. So it does put them at risk. And while there's not a lot of research into dairy cow transportation in New Zealand, because it is quite difficult to do controlled studies on cows during transportation, internationally it's agreed that taking these 3 steps, so providing rest, providing water and providing roughage up until the time of transportation, can really reduce the risk of cows going down during transport or once they arrive at the plant.
Okay, so pulling all that together, what is the best plan for setting cows up for a safe journey?
So providing water right up to the point of loading so that she's really well hydrated and can make it to the other end of the journey where she can top back up at the processing plant. Minimising the time spent on the yard before loading. So I think working with transporters in my previous role, something they quite like to say or a phrase they use is standing stock off. And to a dairy farmer in spring, standing stock off is putting them on concrete or some sort of laneway to protect your pastures. But then in the context of preparing your cull cows for transport, it's just keeping them off that really lush green feed and providing that sort of drier roughage like Stacey spoke about earlier. So don't stand them off on your yard. Take them off that lush pasture, but have them in a grazed out area so they're still getting that rest as well. Double checking the location on the day. So we know farmers are asking when they're booking these in, but it could be you might have rung up and booked them in 2 weeks ago and things could change. And then on the day, something could go wrong as well. Maybe their processing plant's had a breakdown and they're going to get it diverted to another one. So you might want to kind of go, actually, now that I know it's a slightly longer journey because something's gone wrong, I might just keep these 2 girls home and send them next time. So just kind of reassessing and confirming the location. And so while farmers are doing a really good job on those things, we do know that there is a barrier. So a question we ask in the animal care consult is how much notice farmers get. So I think generally they've booked in well in advance and they kind of know, oh, the truck's going to be here in, 2 to 3 weeks, there'll be a slot coming up. Then they get the phone call just confirming the exact date and time. And most farmers have 48 hours notice, but sort of half of them get less than 24 hours notice. And so that makes it quite challenging to do this good preparation and having them drafted out separately for rest. So if you've booked them in, but maybe you haven't heard from your either meat company rep or your transport driver, just being proactive and keeping in touch. If you kind of think, oh, the day's coming up, but I haven't heard anything, the communication piece helps set up the rest of the preparation. So yeah, being proactive in that space as well.
Okay. Now, I'm sure you've both picked up some practical tips from farmers to make this easier. Can you share some of those with us?
Sure. So last season when I was writing an article around cull cow transport, I ran around a couple of farmers in the Waikato, and Anne had a really good tip. So her loading yard is the dairy yard with the kind of ramp on the side. So obviously there's no reticulated water. That'd be a terrible tripping hazard during milking. But when the cows are in there waiting to be collected, she just fills up a cut down 200 litre drum with the wash down hose. So like cheap and easy to just make sure those cows have water right until the last moment.
Yeah, I guess I can add to that as well. The good old 200 litre drum trick is something that we personally did at home on the farm ourselves. But yeah, we had our cattle yards that were completely separate from the cow dairy. So we would typically have to walk our cows to the yards. But because there was no reticulated water supply there, we would typically, fill up a couple of 20-litre calf buckets, chuck them on the back of the truck. And as we were walking those cows to the yards, we'd just take the water with us. We were already doing the trip anyway. So it was sort of a bit of a farm protocol that's just what we did. And it was also quite helpful that we had a paddock next to the yards. It was a larger paddock, so it was far too big for 3 cows, for example. But, we just chuck up a couple of standards and grab a reel and just have a small area that we could section off, and so the cows could effectively walk between the yard and that sort of paddock area. And we'd typically, if we had the time, we would send a few milking cows ahead of them and just have them graze out the space before removing them, and then you've sort of got like a grazed area that they can rest. And we would typically actually grab a couple of slabs of hay, usually left over from bedding the calf sheds or something like that. There would always be something lying around, so we'd just get some roughage from the hay sheds and put that down for them as well. So, it didn't have to be too complicated. We just used the resources that we had on hand.
Yeah, we did sort of similar when I was farming down in Southland. We always had hay in the calf sheds for them to eat, not as the bedding. And when we bought our conventional bales in winter to set up for calving, we just make sure we had a few extra to use for cull cows later in the year. We had heaps of baleage, but you don't necessarily want to cut open a 200 kg bale for 5 cows. That's a lot of food. And just thinking about Stacey and the 20-litre calf buckets, those are gold, and it is frustrating when they go missing from your calf shed and then someone stacks them together and you have to be Superman to separate them. So yeah, we've got lots of examples like this from talking to farmers through the care consults and then just sort of generally engagement. And probably one thing is making sure your farm team know. So when we do the care consults, we're normally talking to the share milker or the owner. They might not necessarily be the person that's milking those cows out this morning and putting them sort of in the small paddock waiting for the transport. So making sure your farm team is aware of the good preparation requirements, but also can kind of make the call if something does change on the day, that they don't have to send all 10 cows that are booked in if actually maybe this cow's better off staying at home for another couple of weeks. They're empowered to make that call and manage those risks around transport. But Jack, you've been through your podcast and experience doing animal care in a previous role. I don't know if you've got any other tips as well.
I think it links to what you were talking about, being proactive with communication. I remember back rub was a concern for the folks scheduling the trucks, and they really appreciated the farmers who let them know when they booked them in if they were sending tall cows, because then they could make sure that they, put them in the run in a way that they were loaded into the best part of the truck for them.
Cool.
Good little extra tip.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's episode. Ngā mihi nui to Penny Timmer-Arends and Stacey Hendriks for giving us some insight to what happens during transport and what we can do as farmers. Transport is stressful for livestock, as they said, but with good preparation on farm and everyone in the supply chain playing their part, we can ensure cattle arrive at their destination fit and healthy. Water, roughage and rest are important things that are within a farmer's control to set their cows up for a safe and comfortable journey. Good communication with your stock agent, transport company and farm team will help things go smoothly for people and animals on the day. If you want to find out more on this topic, head over to our website at dairynz.co.nz/transport. Thanks for tuning into this episode of Talking Dairy. Make sure to hit follow so you can keep up to date with our latest episodes. You can also keep up with DairyNZ News on Facebook, Instagram and LinkedIn, or go to our website and sign up for our fortnightly DairyNZ News emails. As always, if you have any feedback on this podcast or have some ideas for future topics or guests to have on the show, please email us at talkingdairy@dairynz.co.nz. Mā te wā, Mōri ora, catch you next time.